Part 24, Panorama of Fear. Chapter 1, The Hollow Echo of Victory. The joy of conquest is a fleeting chemical surge, a brilliant flare that dies the moment it reaches its zenith. For her, the peak had been the goal for weeks, a jagged obsession that pierced the clouds in her every waking thought. But as she stood upon the open height, the exhilaration did not settle into satisfaction. Instead, it curdled. The heavy price the victory had paid, the bruised muscles, the scorched lungs, and the sheer mental exhaustion became a weight more crushing than the climb itself. The bright, unforgiving clarity of the midday sun did not offer a golden hour of triumph. It cast a harsh, clinical light across the ridges, reflecting the hollow cold growing deep within her bones despite the heat of the solar glare. In the silence of the high altitude, her mind began to translate the environment into the language she knew best, music. The wind was no longer just moving air. It was a section of strings beginning a sharp and rising sweep. It wasn't a melodic ascent, but a chilling, dissonant texture that suggested a hidden threat. It was a leitmotif of danger, a sonic representation of the ancient terror that these mountains kept locked behind walls of granite and ice. The peaks did not welcome her. They tolerated her, and the sudden shift in the light felt like a silent promise that the debt for her intrusion was not paid yet. The physical world began to distort under the pressure of her rising anxiety. The empty space around her seemed to expand at an impossible rate, pushing the horizon further away, while, drawing the immediate edges closer, the sheer descent beneath her boots ceased to be a geological feature, became a yawning maw, an architectural throat waiting to swallow her whole. It brought with it a terrifying magnetic pull, the call of the void. A sudden, lurching feeling took hold of her, a whisper in her inner ear, suggesting that she must simply let go and surrender to the gravity that governed all things, obey nature's unforgiving and binary law. Chapter 2, The Dissonant Descent. The mental music reached a frantic pitch and then suddenly snapped. The crescendo halted, the imagined orchestra fell silent, and for a moment the world was terrifyingly mute. She stood frozen, her hand hovering near a cold rock face, forcing down the rising, sudden dread that threatened to paralyze her. She knew that panic was a death sentence at this altitude. The only way to survive, the only way to ever find true peace amidst the panorama of fear, was to mute the internal noise and proceed with a quiet, patient tread. The wind began a low and mournful hum as she started her descent. It was a subterranean sound. A cello played with a heavy bow, whispering secrets to the jagged stone. It spoke of the history of this place, of all the travelers who had become a permanent part of the earth, forgotten and alone in the crevices where the sun never reached. She tried not to look at the narrow gaps between the boulders, fearing she might see the remnants of those who had failed to pay the mountain's toll. Her fingers began to tremble as she reached for the first icy ledge of the downward path. The grip she had held so firmly during the ascent now felt frail and uncertain. The friction between her gloves and the stone seemed to vanish, the rock turning slick as if it were intentionally rejecting her touch. Upon the very limit of the edge, she felt the full force of the mountain gale, a lashing wind that sought to peel her away from the cliff face like a dead leaf. The sun beat down with a deceptive warmth, illuminating every crack and fissure with brutal honesty. To her tired eyes, the shadows in the crags mimicked giants in a dark parade, ancient sentinels watching her every move. Beneath her feet, the brittle, frozen grass, sparse and hardy, was crushed within the small patches of shade. Each snap of the vegetation sounded like a breaking bone in the stillness, a sharp percussion that kept time with her descending footsteps. Chapter 3, The Symphony of the Void. She paused for a moment to look toward the valley far below. It was a different world down there, a place of soft edges and life shimmering under the high noon sky. It looked like a distant paradise, beautiful and utterly unreachable. Between that safety and the stinging glare of the high-altitude snow, there was only a vast vertical desert. She stood upon the terrifying brink, a speck of life caught between the blinding light of the sky and the hunger of the earth. Each heartbeat began to echo like a heavy drum, a rhythmic thudding that resounded in the hollow of her chest and vibrated in her ears. It was the only tempo she had left to follow. Her senses started to grow entirely numb, the thin air providing little comfort. Fatigue, heavy and leaden, put her spirit to the test, whispering that it would be so much easier to simply sit down and rest against the sun-warmed stone. The sky above was a piercing, vibrant blue, a stark canvas for the coming change in weather. The peaks around her, once majestic landmarks, now stood as sharp silhouettes, jagged teeth biting into the azure firmament. The landscape was now entirely devoid of any comfort. It was a high contrast world of blinding light and lethal heights. As she navigated a particularly narrow traverse, she remembered every choice that had led her here. She saw the reckless pride of her younger self, the hubris that had fueled her lonely climb, and the belief that she could conquer something so vast. But the mountain remained unconquered. It was merely climbed. Now, stripped of her ego, the only constant was the fear. It was a living thing that marked the slow and steady march of time, turning seconds into hours under the unmoving sun. Chapter 4. The Fragile Rhythm of Survival. A pebble broke away from the path, dislodged by the tip of her boot, and tumbled into the void. She watched it fall, a tiny, silent descent that signaled a vast and bottomless despair. The silence of the heights, which she had once found peaceful, was now destroyed by the sound of her own gasps, short, ragged pulls of thin air that burned her throat. The ghosts of her past failures seemed to linger in the bright haze of the afternoon. They weren't literal spirits, but the memories of every time she had doubted herself, pulling at her now with fingers made of doubt. The mountain demanded a total presence of mind. It insisted that she must persist through the mental fog or join the many spirits who were lost to history in these high, lonely places. She felt the physical pull of gravity's dark hand, as if it were a literal cord tied to her waist, a heavy weight that begged for her to fall and end the struggle across this vast and unforgiving land. She heard the siren of the mountain call, the seductive promise of the long sleep, the end of the effort, the surrender to the elements. The ice began to crack beneath her weight as she stepped onto a hidden shelf of snow. It was a sharp, crystalline sound, a warning shot fired from the frozen ground itself. She froze, her heart leaping into her throat, realizing now it was far too late to turn back or find an easier way. She was committed to this specific descent, caught in the spinning of a world she could no longer control. Chapter 5. The Resonant Resolution. She shut her eyes against the dizzying spin of the heights, trying to find her center, as the panorama shifted from white to black behind her eyelids. The battle was no longer against the rock or the wind. It was a war raging somewhere within the architecture of her own mind, with no clear path to lead her safely back. She had to. Her breath came out in faint clouds, visible even in the daylight, like spirits fleeing from a weary frame. She felt as though she were evaporating, her essence being drawn out by the dry air. In the full exposure of the day, she realized with a humbling clarity that the mountain did not care to know her name, or her story. To the stone, she was nothing more than a temporary shadow passing over its face. The sun sat high, indifferent to the struggle of the soul beneath it, shining with a brilliance that had existed long before her and would remain long after. The ancient stories that the peaks told in their silent language predated the very birth of human plan or ambition. She clung to the rock, her life now a matter of nothing but her will, and a fraying rope against a jagged wall. The air around her grew entirely still, a terrifying vacuum of sound as the wind died down for a brief, breathless moment. It was as if the world were holding its breath, awaiting the inevitable fall that seemed etched into the landscape. She began to notice the microtextures of the mountain, the way the lichen clung to the shadow side of the boulders, or how the mica and the granite caught the sun like a staccato of light. These were the grace notes of the climb, small details that grounded her when the grand vista became too much to bear. She realized that the mountain was not just a monolith of fear, it was a complex composition of mineral and time. But in the center of her frantic, exhausted mind, a spark of stubborn fire began to glow. It wasn't the fire of pride this time, but the basic, primal instinct to survive. The strength that she had been terrified she wouldn't find started moving through her limbs, a slow warmth in the blood, despite the exhaustion. She placed one foot firmly on a narrow shelf and reached for a notch within the crag. She didn't think, she simply moved. In that moment of absolute peril, she found a deeper version of herself, a version that didn't need the joy of conquest, only the steady rhythm of the task. When her tired limbs began to slump and lag, this inner core pushed them forward. Every movement was now a calculated note in a grander theme. She was no longer fighting the mountain, she was participating in its silence. The panorama was no longer a grand, terrifying vista. It had shrunk into a map of every hold she needed to take. The world was only 6 inches wide. The distance between her eyes and the rock, the stone, began to feel solid and reliable underneath her hand again, despite the way her weary muscles ached with every pull. The fear was still there, a shadow lingering in the back of her mind, but it no longer drove the way she moved. It was no longer the conductor of her internal orchestra. She found a new rhythm in the stone and the crack, a steady, percussive beat of movement and breath. In this state of pure focus, destiny and labor seemed to finally approve of her presence. The final ledge was navigated, the steepest part of the descent left behind. The peak was reached in her memory, and the summit was won twice, once by the physical feat of her feet, and once within the sanctuary of her soul. She had paid the mountain's cold and heavy price in full, and in return she was allowed to feel a sense of being whole that no easy victory could ever provide. Finally, she reached the lower plateau where the path widened into a gentle slope. She stood atop the world one last time, and looked around at the receding giants under the clear, diurnal sky. The fear had not vanished, but it had turned into a quiet grace, a respect for the power of the earth that surpassed any human ambition. No longer shackled to the shaking ground of her own panic, she found a peace within this lonely place, a resonant resolution that she would carry with her all the way down to the valley floor. The peak was won, a jagged, cold obsession, but victory died within the reaching light. The surge of joy became a dark oppression, a hollow echo in the mountain's height. The wind transformed to strings in rising sweep, a dissonant texture, ancient and unkind. The granite walls their frozen secrets keep, as terror's leitmotif consumes the mind. The yawning maw of gravity takes hold, the call of the void a whisper in the ear. The vertical desert, vast and bitter cold, distorts the world into a map of fear. One final spark of primal fire remains, to mute the noise and find a steady tread. Through leaden fatigue and heavy mental chains, he finds a quiet grace where ghosts once led.